Birds leaving the nest. Almost 2 fortnights had passed since Damori and Tanar sparred in the meadow. Nyansvet was flush with preparations as the entire kingdom counted down the days before the royal announcement of Mieko's betrothal to Folsen. Damori had been lucky. King Kaelin had been so preoccupied by the ceremonies associated with Mieko's upcoming nuptials that he hadn't even noticed Damori had been missing for several months. She was lucky, but the notion made her sad. There was nothing about her existence to amount to even a mere distraction to the king. She was nothing to him, and it hurt. She was further saddened by her overwhelming burdens. With so many chores, she could not escape to the Jade Veld to practice with Tanar and his father. She had missed 2 scheduled meetings with Nation and Tanar. Luckily, she devised a way to get word to Nation by sending a clever peach-colored dove she had found along the way to the Jade Veld one day, whilst in the Black Wildwood. The dove had actually stood watch over several training sessions in the Jade Veld. It kept its eyes glued to Damori the entire time, occasionally fluttering its wings with concern when Tanar was noticeably more aggressive. When the session was over and Damori rode the stallion back to the farmer's barn, she noticed the dove flying overhead. It followed her to the rear gates of Nyansvet and stood perched on a stone pollard. The first day Damori realized she would never complete her chores in time to meet King Nasian in the forest. She saw the dove perched on a branch at the back gate, eagerly awaiting her exit. She raced back inside to the servants' quarters and tore a piece of parchment from a long scroll. On the paper, she wrote a note to King Nasian. She returned to the back gate where the dove still lingered. She rolled the note into a tiny scroll and bound it with black string to the dove's left leg. "If you're going to do my bidding," she whispered, "I must decide upon a name for you. Diogenes, I cannot accompany you to the meadow, but take this note to King Nasian." She held Diogenes high above her head and tossed him in the air. He took to the sky quickly, soaring higher and higher. Then he turned east and flew towards the Black Wildwood. King Nasian saw Diogenes land in the meadow, just as he and Tanar were ready to call it quits and head back to Hangvuit. Tanar spotted the note attached to the bird's leg and removed it. He noticed a small drawing on the mini scroll that resembled the king's seal of Hangvuit, and proffered the note to his father. Nation read the tiny scribbling and chuckled out loud. "What does it say, father?" Tanar inquired nervously. "Damori is well, Tanar," Nasian advised. "She is otherwise engaged at the moment. Come, let us return to Hangvuit. We may yet see her after a fortnight." Without another word, he turned and marched across the meadow to forest. His trusted steed waited on the other side. It was a long and quiet ride back home. Tanar was careful not to ask any further questions. He was aware that Nasian was growing impatient with his constant curiosity about Damori, and he managed to temper his inquiries immensely. He did not want to risk his father becoming so annoyed that he stopped their training. He wanted to ensure his ability to master Twisting Dagger, as well provide ample opportunity to see Damori again. Damori sent the dove to deliver the message to Nasian. She would miss yet another training day. He was not surprised. When he read the note the first time he understood what was going on at Nyansvet. Weddings were a sacred time. As much as he was frustrated with Kaelin, he imagined that Shayla's daughter, Mieko, must be a kind and gentle person if she was anything like her mother. He wished nothing but good things for her. He also imagined that Damori must be in a difficult situation with her being so emotionally close to Shayla, even though she was a servant forced to wait hand and foot on the queen and princess. A person with a big ego could never handle such dichotomy in her relationships, but Nasian knew that Damori was humble and loving and wise beyond her years. In her note, Damori concluded that she was bound to see King Nation again, and nothing would prevent her return journey to the Black Forest. Damori was eager to return to the meadow with Nation and Tanar. She'd looked forward to it all week and grew increasingly impatient with the days and nights as they seemed to move at a snail's pace. With the exception of a few moments when she dozed off, Damori stayed awake throughout the night. However, she would always fall dead asleep at the first signs of the sun's rays spread across the sky like a heavenly glow. She would sleep heavily and deep, and she would dream that she'd awaken to a brand new day. In her dream, she jumped out of bed, donned her robe, cloak, hood, and veil, and bounded through the hallways to the back gate. At the back gate she saw Diogenes perched on the stone bollard again. When he saw her approach, he would coo happily. She smiled at him, before vaulting the gate and dashing off. Diogenes would spread his wings, leap into the air and soar higher, until he glided in the sky above her. As Diogenes circled high above the meadow with the usual caution and a skeptical eye, Dumouriez and Tanner quickly engaged in their playful yet skilled combat. They were careful to avoid the watchful eye of King Natian. Swords remained sheathed for safety's sake, but there was a more aggressive tone to their swordplay. The primary aggressor was Tanner, who lunged and launched his sword swings with astonishing power behind each attempt. Dumouriez, on the other hand, opted to evade, duck, avoid, and deflect Tanner's strikes, rather than striking as an aggressor. Remaining in a constant state of defense forced Tanner to come forward, and allowed Dumouriez the opportunity to keep her eyes on him. She relished that time, embracing every second available to lay adoring eyes on Tanner's handsome face and physique. It was only a matter of time before Tanner became frustrated with his inability to land a blow. He was more than eager to exchange smashes and jabs with Dumouriez, but she proved to be far too evasive. Sensing his frustration, Dumouriez switched fighting styles to rising sword, and effectively began landing a flurry of kicks in between sword swings. Although her kicks found their target in Tanner's back, abdomen and thighs, attempts to land strikes with her sword were not as effective. Tanner became more confident, exactly as Dumouriez has hoped. "I was raised on the sword, masked one," Tanner boasted. His words echoed across the empty grassy field as they continued their contrasting battle of swordplay, putting the two styles, rising sword and twisting dagger, against each other. "Perhaps you will wean too soon?" Dumouriez breathed. Tanner was sure he heard shortness in her breath. "Ha! Fatigue is your enemy." Dumouriez shook her head and chuckled. The prince would make better use of his own reserves with quieter lips. For once Dumouriez felt no guilt or sense of impropriety over her chastisement of the prince. Over the months she'd grown more comfortable with their repartee and sarcasm. On the battlefield they were equals, and Tanner had made his feelings quite clear and explicit. She was not to treat him as royalty, but as an enemy, within reason. Dumouriez was happy to oblige, knowing that it made them closer, and it strengthened their abilities as well. As the two warriors took a moment to suss out strategy, Tanner surveyed Dumouriez in her robe and veil. "The sun is high and hot," he said, pointing to the sky. "Yet again you wear a cloak and veil. Why do you refuse to show your face?" "Why does the prince desire to look upon a servant?" she questioned. Tanner chuckled and used his sword to point out her robe, hood, and veil. "You continue to evade my questions, and your cover remains the same. You leave me no choice but to believe you are a hideously ugly troll beneath that garment." "What can be uglier than your technique?" she teased. Dumouriez saw an opening and lunged at Tanner, but he parried her strike at the last second. He backed away and took an on-guard position. "I have an idea. I will allow you best me, and you will grant me the unpleasant horror of looking upon your face." "I do not need your favor to win, my lord," Dumouriez reminded him. Tanner guffawed. "Only fools and ugly women have such humor as you. Tell me, which are you? I will hold your secret as if it were my own." "Only fools and ugly women would be enchanted by your lack of wit," she shot back. "I think that statement hurt my sword's feelings. But do you blame me for being curious about what lies beneath those rags?" Dumouriez lunged at Tanner again, swinging swiftly in full offensive attack. "I only blame you for the flaws in your skill." Tanner backed off as Dumouriez pushed him back with her unrelenting attack. The repetitive sounds of sword meeting sword rang out in echoes through the black wildwood. "Flaws? What flaws?" he contested. Tanner tried to attack, but Dumouriez averted his attempts to strike, swept him off his feet with a low kick, and settled her sword against his neck. "The flaw that leaves you easily defeated." Tanner smiled and shrugged. There was something gloating about his grin. Dumouriez looked down and saw the tip of Tanner's sword planted against her belly. Their competitiveness vanished, carried away by a breeze that raced across the emerald jade veldt and dissolved into the black wildwood tree line. their labored breathing and fatigued grimaces softened into flirtatious grins. Damori lowered her blade and held out a hand to help Tanner to his feet. She pulled him up, and he stepped close to her, blotting out the setting sun and locking his eyes onto the dark sockets where her eyes would be on the other end of her veil. Tanner wanted to stay close to her forever. He wanted to stare into her eyes until life itself no longer mattered, but he knew he could not do so. Damori felt the same way, and somehow their feelings translated into something tangible that each could see, smell, and taste. But Damori also knew this closeness could not last forever. King Nasian was watching, and he would not approve of what he saw. And it was always at the sight of his disapproving glances that Damori would wake from her slumber. The next se'night was different. It elapsed quickly. Days passed with the quickness of hours as movement in the castle went by like a blur. All the preparations had been made for the formal ceremony of Falson's betrothal to Mieko. Damori made a point of avoiding all chores related to the celebration, and this meant avoiding Mieko, as well as Shayla. In fact, she hadn't seen either woman in 5 days. As Damori lay in bed resting, her deep subconscious had a fevered anticipation of seeing Tanner. A strong gust of wind blew through the window. The breeze cascaded across her face, and her eyes fluttered open. The wind extinguished a candle burning beside her empty bed, and she sat up quickly and looked towards the shadows of the room. "Mother!" she called to the darkness. As her eyes adjusted, she could see the triplets and Aolin still asleep in their beds. There was no one else in the room, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Shayla was near. She always felt when her mother was close, and it was that intuition that enabled her to avoid Shayla for 5 days. Each time she felt the Queen's presence, Damori would duck into another passageway or corridor to avoid her. As she sat in bed squinting at the darkness, her intuition was afire in her mind. It was strangely comforting yet disconcerting considering Damori's plans. After much effort, and after her eyes grew accustomed to the dim light in the room, Damori managed to shake off the feeling that she was being watched, and she climbed out of bed. In a few moments she'd splashed cold water on her face from a wooden bucket at the foot of her bed, donned her robe, cloak, hood, and veil, and tiptoed barefoot through the cold stone floors of the corridors in the castle. From the rear exit of the castle, she was just steps away from the imperial gardens and the back gate. She stopped for a moment at the usual hedgerow. This was where she would typically dig up her sword and don her slippers. She hesitated for a moment, allowing guilt to wash over her like a dousing of cold water. And then she dug up her weapon, slung the sling on her sword's sheath over her shoulder, and marched to the wrought iron gate. It was time to leave. As she approached the gate, she stretched out her hand to reach for a rung to climb, but something made her stop suddenly. Her body rocked as she halted her movement as if she was about to fall into a bottomless pit at her feet. The sudden jolt rocked her, and she teetered on her tiptoes for a moment. An expression flashed on her face that was neither alarm nor concern for her safety. It was the same expression she had when she woke up minutes before she sensed she was being watched. Damori spun around and saw her mother, Shayla, standing at the edge of the garden. Her face was blank and unreadable. This gave Damori goosebumps. Shayla was not one to hide her feelings, except perhaps where the king was concerned. If Shayla had chosen to hide her feelings from Damori, it was because she was angry. "You promised me you wouldn't leave the grounds," Shayla barked sternly. Her voice was scratchy and hoarse, as if she'd only awakened moments before. Damori studied Shayla for a moment, mentally shook off the feelings of guilt that were welling inside her. Then, for a moment, she was vexed. She was displeased in Shayla's sudden appearance and annoyed at the tone in her voice. All Damori had ever done was exactly as ordered. She was a servant, after all, she thought. Now she wanted to do something for herself, something that gave her great pleasure after she'd painstakingly attended to the needs of everyone else around her. Still, Shayla was the person she'd called Mom for so many years. Shayla was the one who gave her a feeling of belonging despite being an orphan, she thought. Defiance against Shayla was felt unnatural and disrespectful. Damori cast her eyes down at the ground and shuffled her feet. Nothing caused her greater pain than engaging Shayla in this manner. Still, I did not promise, Mother. She corrected Shayla. You forbade me from leaving. Quite true. Today is your sister's bridal celebration. Shayla's voice was flat and matter-of-fact. Sister? Untrue. I am an orphan. And today is a celebration to which I have no invitation. And what would you have me do about that? Shall I address the king? I would have you take no such action. I accept my place. But please, Mother, do not expect me to delight in it. There was a sudden rumbling in the sky, and Shayla looked out at the dark rain clouds gathering about the peak of the Black Mountain. She hugged herself as a chill ran through her body. It was an odd chill that brought with it a feeling of dark dread. When Shayla lowered her eyes from the dark clouds in the sky, she noticed that Damori had taken a more defiant stance. Although she kept her gaze focused on the ground, Shayla could see that not only had her daughter learned to keep a woman's secrets, she'd also learned to embrace a woman's determination. Her daughter was growing more independent, and Shayla relished the thought so much it made her smile. Unfortunately, there were more pressing and dangerous matters to address, and Shayla, too, adjusted her posture to affirm her authority as she marched to within inches of the back gate. Stand away from the egress, Damori. She spoke sternly. I am your queen. Queen of Nyansvet. I command you to stay. I demand it. The words were barely out of her mouth when Shayla wished that she'd never uttered such a demand. She could see tears rolling down Damori's face. Stay for what reason, Empress Shayla? Damori made sure to emphasize the title. What place do I have here that cannot be easily taken by another? No one can take your place, you are my... Her voice trailed off. I am your what? Damori challenged. Your daughter. No. We only pretend as much, my queen. Although I am grateful for the illusion, it is time for it to end. So Damori turned away and grabbed a hold of a rung on the gate. Shayla quickly moved behind her and grabbed her arm. Shayla softened her voice, pleading, Do not leave in this manner. Damori laid her hand over Shayla's and softly lifted it away, but she held it and brought Shayla's palm to her lips and kissed it. In what way does the method of my leaving affect the outcome, Mother? Shayla's heart skipped and she heard herself gasp. Mieko needs her mother on this day, Damori added. She will be heartbroken without you, as am I. Damori turned away and vaulted the back gate in one swift movement. Shayla was stolid as she watched Damori disappear behind the grassy hillside. Her face showed no emotion, no expectation. It was impossible to do anything because the pain she felt in her heart simply wouldn't let her move.